Of all the things they might tell us, why are they telling us this? And that matters, I think, more and more, because it's not always about the truth, is it? People say things for other reasons. One of the things we see over the 20th century is a growing cry for ourselves to be happy, as if happiness is a default position. And if we're not happy, there's a problem. Now, that's absurd. It was the 1930s, and there was an Institute for Propaganda Analysis, which was in New York, and they came up with these 7 kinds of propaganda, and one of them was name-calling, and it was glittering generalities, which was just using vague terms like freedom and democracy. People are still using these things, and that's because they work.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Change Your Minds podcast. My name's Owen Fitzpatrick, and I'm really delighted to be joined by Peter Lamont today. Peter Lamont is a professor of history and the theory of psychology at the University of Edinburgh. He was, in the last century, which is a long time ago, a magician, and he writes and speaks about curious things such as magic, psychic phenomena, belief, wonder, and critical thinking. And just so you don't just hear it from me, his latest book, Radical Thinking, one of the testimonials or one of the endorsements is by none other than Derren Brown, the legendary magician. Derren calls the book witty, wise, and wonderfully observed. This is a book for curious people, which will change how you see the world, and I couldn't agree more. In this particular book, Peter talks about this notion of radical thinking, which again, he distinguishes it and differentiates it from critical thinking. But over the course of this conversation, I'm hoping to deep dive into exactly what Peter means when he talks about radical thinking and some of the skills we can learn to be more effective with it. As many of you know, my work on inner propaganda lines up beautifully with this, so I'm looking forward to getting lots of insights and ideas that I can incorporate in the upcoming book. Peter, you're very, very welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time, mate.
Thank you for having me.
So just to start off with, and I love the book, and the way in which you wrote it was you took us on a journey of Edinburgh, which is one of my favorite cities. Absolutely love the place. And as you do that, as you bring us through that journey, you start to help us understand the way in which we think and the way in which we believe what we believe. But you start off, and one of the things that you differentiate and distinguish is radical thinking from critical thinking. Could you share a little bit more about what you mean by radical thinking and why you chose to use that as opposed to critical thinking, which I know you've taught courses on and whatnot in the past?
There's a couple of reasons. So first of all, critical thinking, what's that? And people have very different answers to that question. So even in the literature on critical thinking, people define critical thinking as an attitude or a trait or a disposition or a set of skills and so on. And then more broadly, everyone reckons they do critical thinking. If you talk to anyone in a university, certainly everyone does critical thinking, even though they're doing very different things. And then you've got this slightly absurd situation where Christian fundamentalists will say they like critical thinking. But in this case, they mean you can use critical thinking to argue against the facts of evolutionary theory, because they contradict scripture and so on. You have this situation where everyone thinks that critical thinking is a good thing, but no one's quite clear on what it is. So what I did, because I'm primarily a historian, is I looked at the history of critical thinking. And one of the common themes you get, which will be familiar, is that critical thinking is supposed to be about how you think, not what you think. So whatever you think, it's not about where you end up, it's about how you get there. But what happened over the 20th century is that people began to look at critical thinking in terms of where you end up, in terms of what you think, especially in terms of getting it right. We can talk about this later if you like. But so part of the problem is that it shifted, I think, too much from how you think to what you think, and in terms of getting it right. So I wanted to get away from that. I wanted to get away from critical thinking as a way to get it right, or indeed get it wrong, and get back to the process itself instead of the outcome. So that's how I ended up using a different term. And the reason for the term is because the word radical, from the Latin radic, means root. So radical thinking is thinking about the roots, the foundations of our beliefs. And that's what I wanted to get at. So regardless of the outcome, it's the process. It's how do we reach the conclusions that we do, and what are the various things that shape our thoughts. So that's the main.
For me, I suppose the way I look at it is similar to what you point out in the book, is this notion of epistemic humility, the ability to be able to recognize in ourselves. And to me, it's always been a problem where people say you need to challenge your limiting beliefs, because the problem is we don't differentiate often between what's a belief and what's knowledge. So it's not that I'm walking around going, I've got all these limiting beliefs I need to challenge. Well, if you knew that they were limiting beliefs and you knew they were only beliefs and you knew you could challenge them in the first place, then you might find it easier to do that. But the problem is that it's often about, to me, this overall perspective. One of the things that I think Radical Thinking is a wonderful book to do, along with books like Think Again by Adam Grant, is to get people to start to go, hang on a second, I need to start challenging my own truth. And you're correct in what you say in terms of, like, I do see objective truth as objective truth, and that's the one, overall truth, as opposed to relativism. But for me, if I'm to try to step into someone else's shoes and to try to be curious enough to understand how they're thinking, they're not just having a point of view. They feel it's true in their bones, right? So to step into their shoes, I suppose this is just the 5 types of truth. It's not true, right? But it's just trying to get people to recognize that if you want to influence someone else, if you want to get through to them, if you want to have a productive conversation, if you want to cure polarization, this whole belief that we sometimes hold on to, which is there is a truth, and naive realism, there is a truth, and I know the truth. But, Peter, you don't really know the truth, but I'll share with you, I'll enlighten you, I'll bring you out of Plato's cave and show you what's really happening. I think that's what so many people do, and I feel that it's just not working. And what I love about your book is because you're turning around and you're not advocating for that. You're turning around and go, no, hold on. This is why we believe what we believe. And if you want to have a shot, you need to first of all have the humility yourself, and you need to be able to ask questions and understand other people's perspectives. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that the starting point, the place I started was what you're calling epistemic humility, which is a good way of thinking of it. But it really is just appreciate that whatever you think, including whatever you think is true, is always based on what you notice and how you interpret it. And we notice a fraction of what's going on, and whatever we do notice, we need to interpret it in a particular way, because there's always more than one way to interpret evidence. And therefore, whatever you take to be true, you might be wrong. More likely, and I think this is the case maybe with, for the moment we'll call science, that's another conversation, is what we get is what you might call a partial truth, or a particular truth based on particular data at a certain time and place, which we can then say is true, but it's always a particular part of reality we're getting at. And the extent to which we think it's true, like objectively true, that's not a phrase I would use, but I know what you mean because I've worked as a psychology department for a long time. It's the best we've got. It's based on the best evidence we have. It's based on scientific methods, which are typically ways to rule out certain kinds of biases and limits and so on. But nobody in science, at least I've not met one, would say science is certain, the scientific knowledge is certain. It's objective in certain respects. For example, we have experimental controls in an experiment to rule out certain things and so on and so forth. You can agree to certain rules. You can agree to certain forms of analysis in advance and so on. But these are still agreements. These are still decisions that we make, and decisions, by definition, are not objective. These are options. You might be very good ones, and you might have a good track record, and so on. So the aim for objectivity is a fine thing. The claim to objectivity is where it becomes a bit tricky, I think.
One of the things that you mentioned, you talk about science there, is you talk about the difference between the process and the outcome. And I love that distinction that you made, because for me, it was something I hadn't thought of that way before, but it helped me understand a lot of what can go wrong in science, as well as why we need to still look at science as having so many answers. Could you share a little bit about when you talk about the difference between the process, the scientific process versus the outcome, and why we need to distinguish between those two?
Well, it's part of the more general thing. So for me, scientific knowledge is part of what I'm talking about, which is knowledge, the word we would use. And that's based on a process of looking at certain things, noticing certain things, interpreting certain things, sometimes in life, but certainly in science, testing certain options and so on and so forth. And that's the process. In science, we'd think of methods, for example, with data collection, data analysis, and so on, the process, which then leads to an outcome, which is a piece of knowledge. In science, it would be a piece of scientific knowledge. It might be in a peer-reviewed journal, an article which makes a particular claim based on this process, based on this data and the interpretation of this data, the analysis of the data, and so on and so forth. So the distinction there would simply be that might be simplistic, but that scientific knowledge is the sum of claims made by science, things that scientists believe to be true. And the process is how they get to those particular claims, rather than, say, the opposite ones or different ones. And in that sense, it's analogous to all thinking.
And I think also when you use science, you have that set process that you engage in. The outcomes can change over time. So it's like Bayesian reasoning when, you make certain predictions, you have certain hypotheses, and over time, you learn more, you get more data, you get more information, and you update it. Like during COVID, for instance, there was a lot of things that initially came out that were wrong, were adjusted and observed. And people use that in order to beat science over the head and say, oh, scientists don't know what they're talking about. Yeah. But again, I think I've heard you make the point that said, well, no, that's exactly what science is. Science is constantly looking for more data to test your hypotheses, because it's more about the process of going through it as opposed to, right, now we figure this out.
Yeah. And if you look at science, in terms of what science is, and there's a huge discussion we could have about that, but there are no, let's say, universally agreed boundaries of science, right? They're fuzzy at best. But there are common themes within science. So when you talk about, like, science has certain rules or methods, there's a general agreement amongst scientists that certain things should be done. And at the heart of that, I'm guessing now, I haven't spoken to all scientists, but a common theme is what we call falsifiability or falsification, which is testing a hypothesis to try to show it's wrong. And at the heart of that is an acceptance that we have no certainty and that we can't get it. That's not what science is about. It's part and parcel of, we'll call goods. Not all science is, necessarily competent, but it's at the heart of all good science that we try to do that, and that we don't think that when we get a certain answer or outcome, now we know for certain that's the case, which is precisely why, and COVID's a good example, why if new data comes along, or a better theory comes along, scientists change their minds. And that's where I think the strength of science lies. There's an inherent humility to that. Now, I'm not saying that all scientists always do that, but certainly that's, I think, what most scientists mean when they talk about the scientific method.
Inside your book, one of the things you talk about is similar to this notion of updating science, for example. But knowledge updates as well over time. So you're the product of your time, and you can only make decisions based upon the information you have that is given to you from the culture that you're in. And you gave examples like David Hume and whatnot. But one thing that I found fascinating was Encyclopedia Britannica. Could you share a little bit about what you found out about, I think it was the second edition or so of the book, and what that teaches us?
Yeah, so in part of the book, which was based on a course was about finding local examples. Again, you can go back to mine, but I wanted examples that other people had heard of, even if they'd never been to Edinburgh. And Britannica is a good one because what happened in the 1780s is that the son of a baker and the son of a wig maker decided to publish a book that would, it was described as a book that would contain all of human knowledge, which is a remarkable idea. And they published it and they called it Encyclopedia Britannica. But this referred to the second edition because the first edition was much more limited. So the second edition of Britannica was supposed to represent the whole of human knowledge.
And this was around the 1780s, was it?
1780s, that's right, yeah. And it appeared a couple of lots where my office is, which is why it's a bit of quirky local history. But of course, what that is such a strange idea. So then when you look at it, you see some things. So for example, there's an article in the second edition of Britannica on history. And it's about the history of the world since the beginning of the world in 44 pages. And when you read it, you discover that the world began about 4,000 years BC because, as some people will know, that was what Christian scholars thought was when God created the world. It's still what some creationists think. So when people got this, nobody wrote in and said, I want my money back, this is nonsense. That's what they took for granted. So this book on the whole of human knowledge was obviously based on what was taken for granted at the time. And what's also curious about this particular edition is that at the same time they were producing this book, in the 1780s, a man called James Hutton was a few hundred yards away on Salisbury Crags studying rock formations, and he discovered something which told him that the Earth was much, much, much older than the Bible story suggested. And he gave a paper at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And that paper is traditionally seen as the birth of geology. Now, there's no mention of geology in Britannica, of course. There's the words in there. Because it's not available yet. Right? So you can't, and this is the case for all of us, whatever we think about anything, whatever beliefs we have, they have to be based on the options that we have. And of course, we often don't have as many options as we might. And at any given time and place, those options will depend on what's around. I use that example partly because the place where Hutton's paper was presented is at the end of Nicholson Street. And Nicholson Street is also where Britannica first appeared in a shop. And so what you've got is a nice instance of in the same place, within yards, at the same time, you've got two fundamentally different worldviews being put forward.
Wow, I found it fascinating just reading about it, but hearing about it again brings it even makes it even more impressive. There's a few other things that you mentioned which I thought were particularly important to talk about. One of the things that I suppose I spend a lot of time on is how we convince ourselves of things. And so often I think people turn around and go, well, I'm really intelligent and I'm very rational thinker, therefore I don't convince myself of anything like that. I talk about Nikola Tesla had a bunch of absolutely wacky, crazy beliefs. Galileo had some very strange beliefs as well, even for his time. And you mentioned Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yeah. Yeah. Isaac Newton believed that God created the world about 4,000 years BC. So that wasn't crazy at the time. And there's some people now would say, no, that's true. And they would say, and Isaac Newton thought that too, right? So that's the way first. People are, you look at authorities, and to us, it's how could those people think that? Whereas to people who believe the opposite to us, it's, well, see, those people thought that. And that becomes a kind of indirect evidence for what they think. And Doyle was obviously the creator of Sherlock Holmes, and he met the inspiration for Holmes he lived in George Square, which is where my office is, so that's why they're nice local examples. And Doyle created this character, Sherlock Holmes, who apparently notices everything, which is, of course, absurd, but Holmes is a fictional character, we have to remember. We are much more like Dr. Watson, right? We don't notice things, and we need to take comfort in that. But Doyle himself believed in spiritualism, and he believed in spiritualism, a number of reasons, but one of them was that he was obviously a very bright guy, and he justified his belief. Some of these beliefs quite odd, such as Harry Houdini is not a magician, he has genuine powers, despite the fact that Houdini told him personally he didn't have any powers. He found ways to justify his belief. And that's what you find in the history of these things. I've studied what I call extraordinary beliefs, since the 20th century. And you find this all the time. You find people constantly finding ways to justify beliefs that I personally don't have. But that's what we do all the time. Whatever beliefs we have, we find ways to justify them. And if we're smart, then we find good ways to justify them. What I've never found, every single person, with every single belief I've looked at, everyone's skeptical but open-minded.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what you think. That's a form of presentation. I've never met anyone who's, gullible and narrow-minded. Everyone tells the story.
Sure. What I see is whenever we use logical reasoning, we tend to use it in generally two ways. It's used to be able to prove what we want to believe is true, or to prove our thesis is true, or it's used to discover what is actually true. So you either use it as an investigator or use it as a prosecutor. And again, these are just metaphors and there's all sorts of ways. But the point I'm trying to make here is so often everybody can believe in these extraordinary things, but that first of all, and this is something I've heard you say, they have to first challenge the ordinary. So in order for you to believe in extraordinary, you're going to find some challenge with some ordinary plausible explanation that's given. And that's where, let's say, we move into extraordinary or move into conspiracies. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's kind of, it's almost by definition. So I use the word extraordinary because I think there's less baggage, but another one would be paranormal or supernatural. So what are these things? Supernatural, beyond natural, paranormal, beyond normal, extraordinary, beyond ordinary. So normal, natural, ordinary, well, that depends on time and place, the things that we take for granted, the stuff that we generally think that requires no justification. If we want to stay, or if we choose to believe in something that's beyond that, then we first have to decide that the ordinary, the normal, the natural is inadequate, right? So if I say I believe in horses, you might wonder why I'm saying that, but you're not going to need more information. If I say I believe in unicorns, you're going to need more than that, and I'm going to have to do more than that. And you think, oh, well, yeah, but I've seen them with my own eyes. How would I say that? But I wasn't dreaming, right? I wasn't drunk. I wasn't on anything. I'm not making it up. I'm not lying. I was wide awake. What people do, and this is absolutely typical of when people report these things. They almost systematically rule out ordinary explanations. And of course, they're doing this in their head as well. I think we could safely assume that they are looking at something thinking, it's a ghost? What am I seeing? Am I, you pinch yourself? Is it an optical illusion? And so this is what I mean by that to believe in the extraordinary, you need to reject the ordinary, because the ordinary we've already bought into. We need to go beyond that, and to go beyond that, to believe in something that's paranormal, you need to say, well, normal doesn't cut it. as an explanation, right? So there's something else. And then, if you then do that, then it's much more plausible. Other evidence of extraordinary things becomes more plausible because you've experienced something. Miracles can happen. Therefore, well, maybe that's a miracle too. So I think there's a process of having an experience that you cannot explain in a normal way or an ordinary way, which then gets you to something extraordinary. And once you've made that jump, then other extraordinary things become much more plausible.
How do you explain, or what's your theory for why people believe certain things rather than others? Because I think one of the things I love that you said as well is about the importance of context in the decisions that we make, and there's a whole bunch of different variables. But when it comes to, let's think mesmerism, right? So mesmerism started, Franz onto Mesmer with the magnets. It's all good. How is it working? Well, it's working because he's using the magnets to be able to affect the, let's say, essence of the person. Then along comes others, James Braid or whatnot, and well, actually, it's not to do with animal magnetism, it's to do with hypnosis or hypnotism. From your perspective, spies are taught to try to make it so that when you've got a cover story, sprinkle as much sort of truth in there as possible to make it sound as correct as you can. And ultimately, the same techniques that a lot of people will use to, let's say, spread conspiracy theories or spread misinformation sometimes or spread disinformation sometimes are the same techniques that are used to spread, let's say, inverted commas, real information, useful information. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of techniques that are used from extraordinary to conspiracy to cults to political leaders, anyone trying to spread words? How do they use critical thinking, logical thinking, rational reason to be able to achieve their ends?
So do you mean in terms of people who want to persuade us, or in terms of people believing?
Persuade us.
The persuasion stuff, I think, there's a bunch of things that people have said. And again, you might know this better than me, but there were 7 rules of propaganda. But what we know is that even if we identify a bunch of common themes, that knowing those themes isn't going to stop us from being persuaded. Right? It was the 1930s, and there was an Institute for Propaganda Analysis, which was in New York, which is like where you are. And they came up with these 7 kinds of propaganda. And one of them was name calling. So how do you persuade people of a particular thing? Well, you call your opponent bad names, like in the States, things like communist or heretic or something, right? And it was glittering generalities, which was just using vague terms like freedom and democracy, or making America great again, which is an old phrase. So those are things you could say, well, these are things that people do to persuade folk. Of course, they're still using them. People are still using these things. And that's because they work. And why do they work? Well, any of these things can work. But whether they work and whether anyone spots them will very much depend on the context. You know, a glittering generality, make America great again, that's a very vague thing. Now, say something vague, then it's harder to reject, so it's easier to accept. It's easier to add on all kinds of examples. Take back control. People still use these kinds of things. It's quite easy to think, yes, I think we should take back control. I think we should make America great again, and so on. But what's the alternative? If you want to persuade people of your point of view, you look for a motto or something simple that people can buy into. On the other side, yes, we can. That doesn't get much vaguer than that. But so there are things that people do to persuade. One of these ways is to diss your opponent. Another way is to use very vague terms, which are easier to accept because they're just so sponge-like that people can add anything they want into them.
One of the things that radical thinking in your book, one of the things you do is obviously you give people skills that aren't going to completely make them immune from, let's say, propaganda persuasion at all, but it's hopefully to get them to recognize how they're being influenced by others. So that's one thing that the skills are useful for. A second thing that the skills are useful for is for people to make better decisions, right? And that means being able to identify some of the biases that you mentioned, the cognitive biases and whatnot. A third way that this book can be useful is to help to firm up your own arguments and to be more persuasive and understand some of the logical fallacies that are often used in that way. But there's a fourth application that I don't think you mention it much in the book, but I think it warrants mentioning. And that's, to me, one of the challenges that we face the current times is we struggle a lot with mental health, right? That's my background in terms of I was a therapist for years. I struggled with my own mental health when I was a teenager. And I look at tools like what I'm working on and like radical thinking as being really helpful because the same tools that allow us to recognize biases and fallacies can also help us recognize cognitive distortions, the all or nothing thinking, which is a form of generalities that we use, mental filtering, discounting the positive. These are all highlighted in things like cognitive behavioral therapy as being distortions. And I think this notion of radical thinking could play a huge part in helping us to challenge our own negative beliefs that can lead us down the wrong path. Given that that's not, I know your area is, you're a historian and you're specializing in the area of the history of psychology and whatnot, but have you any thoughts or perspectives about how radical thinking can help, not just in terms of making decisions or understanding how beliefs are formed or persuasion occurs, but also in this space?
It's tricky partly because mental health has become such a vast area. The language has changed. The number of people who talk about it has become enormous compared to what it used to be. And also part of it, because it's the language of mental health rather than mental illness, it's spoken about in very different ways, just in terms of if I can use it, as if it's not such a bad thing as it used to be, as it were. So there are lots of ways in which we talk about mental health, which is similar to talking about anything in terms of what do we actually mean. So because one of the things in the book is about meaning, about how easy we miss these things. So when someone says something, we need to understand what they actually mean by that. So I, as a professor, know that students in much larger numbers than before will report mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, so on. When they do that, they do not use a language that suggests that this is necessarily a clinical diagnosis. And there's a real sense in which it's completely normal to feel anxious and down and so on, and it'd be weirder if we didn't. And one of the things, my partner's a clinical psychologist, and so we talk about these things sometimes. And one of the things that is one of the negative aspects of the growing talk about mental health, there are many positive aspects too, but one of the negative ones is it does seem as if there's an easy pathologization of normal feelings, which is not necessarily helpful. I find that I've had a lot of, just personal chats with students over the years. And sometimes that involves just say, look, I get really down sometimes too. And I get anxious. Every time an exam came up, I was anxious too. That's perfectly normal. And I think part of it is historical in the sense that one of the things we see over the 20th century is a growing cry for ourselves to be happy, as if happiness is a default position. And if we're not happy, there's a problem. Now, that's absurd. And that's another whole conversation. But the idea that we should be happy is an absurd idea. It's nice. No one's against it. But the idea that, and so the idea that if you're not happy, there's some kind of problem with you is also deeply problematic. So, and again, you'll know more about this area than me, but there's a difference between a clinical condition, stroke disorder, stroke, the language is all very, messy, which prevents people from actually getting by on a day-to-day basis. And then there's other stuff which is looser and temporary and not so abnormal, or indeed not abnormal at all. And I think one thing to do would be to just think a bit more carefully about what it is that we're talking about in terms of mental health, and try to get past this growing tendency to think that anyone who has had a personal history is therefore an expert on some condition which could affect different people in very different ways, because so much of it depends on the circumstances. So there's certain ways in which I think it's analogous to the broader thinking.
Yeah. I also like the ideas when you talk about, for example, categorization and how we naturally are, like, our brains are optimized to discriminate in general. That's what we do. The problem is the categorizations that we make is often what leads to, let's say, polarization, or leads to us, to what you were just talking about there, to term ourselves into a certain way. The way in which we understand ourselves or the category that we belong to then defines all the ways in which we think, right? So we almost limit ourselves through the categories we create. There's a concept called E prime, which was created about 70 years ago by a guy called David Burlon. And E prime is English without the verb to be. And the notion is that you're not allowed to say to be, so you have to say, instead of saying this is an apple, you have to say this seems like an apple to me. So it's pretty much taking ownership over your own perception, a little bit like we talked about, taking ownership over your perspective or your point of view and stuff. And there's some, well-known experts, I think it was Albert Ellis, that saw E prime as being a really helpful part of the kinds of therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy and whatnot that he was using. From my perspective, radical thinking itself, if we go from a macro, which is what we were just talking about, to a more of a micro, I think being able to recognize, like, for example, one element is catastrophization. And one of the things that you talk about in the book is a number of questions you can use about, I think it's the purpose, the evidence, like a number of questions you can use to be able to test ideas. I really genuinely believe that for things like, let's say we're catastrophizing, we go, oh my goodness, I'm going to fail, I'm going to ruin my life, this is going to be the worst. There's ways to be able to pull us back from that edge. And I think radical thinking is as good as any of helping us to go, okay, hang on, let's ask these questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like from my partner, who's a clinical psychologist, who read the book and thought, oh, I'm going to use some of this stuff in my work. We didn't talk about details, of course, because it had to be a very, abstract discussion. But I when I thought about I'm quite skeptical about the idea that there's a set of skills. Like, that's a typical kind of critical thinking way, and it's typical in pop psychology books and so on, that the learning the toolkit and all this stuff. And I've tried to avoid that. But at some point you have to say, well, what can you actually do? And so that kind of 3-part list that you mentioned, meaning, basis, function, I think is useful. When I can briefly describe if
yeah.
Great. So I'll in terms of radical thinking, critical thinking, I'll explain it that way, but then people can decide if it's relevant to other things. The first thing to do, if we want to make sense of the world, is start with something, right? With critical thinking, it's always thinking about something. So what I've decided on was, let's look at knowledge claims. Not creative thinking, problem solving, which are all other things. Let's start with things that people say. Any point where someone says, this is the case, or that is the case, which is kind of all the news and everything that we think and believe. Okay, so it's quite a big subject. And then you think, well, how can we make sense of that? And there's three questions I think, and I tell my students to think about. So the first question is the meaning one, which is, what are they actually claiming? Which sounds really obvious, except that it's not, because we constantly talk past each other when we disagree about topics, but we're actually talking about slightly different things or different aspects of a topic. So it's just identifying what the actual claim is and ask, what are they actually saying? And to understand what they mean, you need to understand their point of view, not immediately translate it into yours, okay? So the first thing is that. What is the claim? And that's about meaning. Second, what is the basis of that claim? What's the evidence for that claim? Okay. A lot of people think that should be the first question when people say things. They say, "Oh, what's the evidence?" But to me, that's the second question, because until you know what the actual claim is, you don't know what the evidence is evidence of. Okay. So the first thing, and I'm saying it again because it's astonishing how people go past this so quickly. What are they actually saying? Second, what's the basis of that thing that they said? And third, the one that's often missed, is why are they telling us this? So even if it's true, there's an infinite number of things that are true. Even right now, as we're talking, I could describe an infinite number of things that are true, an infinite number of facts. But of all the things they might tell us, why are they telling us this? And that matters, I think, more and more, because it's not always about the truth, is it? People say things for other reasons, to present themselves in a particular way, to get us to focus on something rather than something else, simply to get attention, which is a currency now that is more valuable than, it's hard to think what's more valuable right now than attention, and so on. And therefore, that's sometimes where logic and evidence that's where the limits are. If we don't understand the context, why are they telling us this thing just to get our attention, just to get us to talk about that? It's got nothing to do with logic or evidence, okay? So we need to think about that too. I think those kind of three things are useful to do with any claim. We can't do it with everything. We don't have that kind of time. But anything that sounds weird or concerning, we can think, what is it? What are we actually talking about? What's the evidence for that? And why are they telling us this? Why are we even thinking about this? Because there's other things we could.
I think that last question in particular is really helpful because it triggers a bit more skepticism. Like it to me, it provokes reactance. It provokes this awareness of, okay, this person is trying, which is true, but this person is trying to get me to think this, or trying to get me to do this, or trying to get me to feel this, or trying to get me to believe this. And just recognizing that in and of itself can, I think, be very helpful for us to be able to really get to the bottom of what the person said. There's one more thing I'd love to chat with you about before we go to the quickfire round. My favorite story of the book, I think, was on self-help, and specifically Samuel Smile's self-help book, the original. I'm also, to be honest, obviously I'm Irish. I'm not a huge fan of Margaret Thatcher. So for me, I kind of read this with a little giggle as well. But could you share what you talked about in terms of what you found out about the book Self-Help?
Oh, yeah, that was a few years ago. So the original self-help book was published by Samuel Smiles. He went to Edinburgh University around the same time as Darwin. And it was an extraordinarily popular book in the middle of the 19th century. And it was a book about how to improve your life. It was called Self-Help, so it's the first self-help book, but it's completely different from the self-help books that came later and the kind of books that you see now. It's really like a bunch of mini biographies of people who tried, many failed, and we'll not go into that just now. So that was a best-selling book of the 19th century. It's outsold Darwin's On the Origin of Species by 5-1. And loads of editions kept appearing until 1986, when a new edition appeared. And this was an abridged edition. and it had a foreword by Sir Keith Joseph, who, for younger people, was the intellectual guru for Margaret Thatcher, who, for younger people, was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom for a number of years, primarily in the 80s. So I saw this book, right, in a charity shop. And I'd read the original book as a history student. And I thought, it looks a bit small. And then I saw the quote from Sir Keith Joseph saying, this book expresses the kind of spirit, the entrepreneurial spirit of Thatcherism or something like that. And I thought, I don't remember that at all. So what I did was I got hold of the edition that the Thatcherite edition was based on. And I went through the whole book. I spent a weekend doing this. It was raining, finding all the things that they took out. And there's all these weird things that they take out, which will be, if you remember that period, will make sense. But the main theme of all the bits that they took out was the theme of helping other people. So they made self-help more selfish. And that just sums up the way self-help has gone. Because Smiles wasn't about, it's all about helping yourself. It's all about selfish goals. He was very much about character and conduct and hard work and helping other people and respect for other people. And if we take that out of any notion of self-help and it becomes all about us, then we find out that we're constantly concerned about why we're not happy. And if there's one thing we need to get past, it's this idea that it's all about us. There's a whole world of people there, and everything we think and feel and do is linked to other people. And if we can't get past ourselves, then I'm not sure what's going to happen. And that's one reason why the understanding other points of view, trying to reduce polarization, all these things are so essential. Because we're kidding ourselves if we think that all our thoughts and feelings are in our brains. That yes, they depend on connections in our brains, but they also depend on other connections, which are the ones between our brains. And that's the stuff that we say and do in interaction. And without that stuff, we wouldn't think anything. We wouldn't have language. We wouldn't have meaning. We wouldn't have context. We'd have no options at all. So part of it, the radical thinking approach, it's not meant to be political, but it is very much about realizing it's not all about you, but your limits are real, and we have similar limits. Because whatever we think, even if we disagree, we all get there through a similar kind of process.
Love that answer. So thank you so much for that. Quickfire round, your favorite movie or our favorite movie, Peter?
I need to be not obvious, don't I? Fabulous Baker Boys. I love that film.
Oh, wow. Very good. Favorite author?
Favorite author?
Our favorite author.
Yeah, I know. I like Somerset Maugham. It's a mad language in a weird world. I remember when I started to read fiction as I grew up properly, I used to love Somerset Maugham.
So that's the book. Favorite book.
Oh, favorite book, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. So favorite author and then favorite book. Somerset Maugham is your favorite author.
Okay. I'm going to say Midnight Children for a book, although any Somerset Maugham book would work too.
Perfect. A favorite artist?
I'll say a local boy, Eduardo Perlozzi.
Very good. Favorite musician?
Oh, God. I'll say Bob Marley because I went travelling, I spent a year travelling back in 89, and I went to many different countries, and there's two musicians that you heard almost everywhere. And one was Bob Marley, and the other was Richard Clayderman, a pianist who, it was a kind of lift music type of thing. And I never got tired of Marley. So anyway, Bob Marley, but not Richard Clayderman.
I was going to say, favorite philosopher?
I'm good if we can say the ideas David Hume, but you've got to take out the racism parts.
Yes.
and there are issues there. But in terms of the main ideas that have shaped it, the skepticism, not the race, the skepticism, that would be, yeah.
Fantastic. Favorite TV series?
Arrested Development.
If you could have any superpower, what would it be?
You're asking a magician. Well, levitation is the hardest to do using trickery. If I could do that for real, I could have a scream with the other.
I was going to say, yeah, and make a tidy profit as well. Ideal at time travel, if you could go anywhere in the past, present, or future, where would you go?
To the middle of the 19th century, so I could see all the magicians and mediums that I've written about for so much, actually see them perform.
Fantastic. A couple more. Alternative, if you could live anywhere else besides where you live, where would you live?
New Orleans.
If you could have any career besides what you do, what would you do?
A full-time writer with a large bank account.
Fantastic stuff. Well, maybe if you mastered levitation, you'll be sorted. Finally, if you've one message for the world on a sort of a big message that you can broadcast to everyone, what would that message be? To everyone in the world sees it, what would the message be?
It's not all about you.
Excellent. Pete, where can people go? Obviously, and I'm speaking to everybody now, I'm telling you, get the book, Radical Thinking. It's an excellent book. It's very fun. It's very enjoyable. Like I said, I mean, you could tell by the way in which I was talking about it, how much I like it. But I think that it's genuinely, along with things like I mentioned before, things like Think Again by Adam Grant, How Minds Change by Dan McGraney. Radical Thinking is an excellent book, and I think that you'll learn a lot from it. So go to get that wherever books are sold. Also, where else can we send people so that they can learn more about you and the work that you do, Pete?
I've got a personal website, which is peterlamont.net, and there's a link there to a Substack, which is just a kind of occasional fun piece that I write and send out. It's free, so that's called the Faculty of Wonder. But you can link to that via the website, and that would be that another way. And then the university website would be where you get more information on my academic stuff.
The university website, which is
the University of Edinburgh website, yes, you can find me there. The personal website is obviously less academic-y.
Sure. Perfect. Well, listen, a big thank you to you, Peter. Really enjoyed our conversation. And to all of you, I'm sure you got a massive amount from Peter. Please do go get his book. I'm telling you, it's a fantastic read. But for now, take care, be well until the next time. May the force be with all of you, and I will talk to you soon. Bye for now.